To everyone. As always, good to see all of you by way of video. And for our reference point tonight, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 24 through 27. And as Brother Rodney made mention of, this will be the solo message for this evening. So I won't go as fast as I normally go as I speed through the devotional message. We are still continuing a series of connected messages revolving around the overarching theme of living like we know who our Father is. And in doing so, we have suggested that being a Christian and living like one is two different things. Because the reality is that every so-called Christian in name doesn't live like it in practice. Since obedience to the gospel of Christ, it simply puts us in a relationship with the Father. But then comes the hard part, because then we have to live like we know who our Father is. And as I mentioned last time, and as I prepare to transition from Paul's letter to the Church of Christ at Corinth, I'm reminded yet again that we started this thematic discussion based on Paul's words in Philippians chapter 3, verse 12 through verse number 16, where Paul acknowledged that he had not attained spiritual maturity yet, that he had not become like Christ. But Paul was pursuing it. He was chasing after it. He was pursuing it with the intensity of a runner, stretching, reaching, and straining toward the finish line. And then he says in that passage, he says that those of us who are mature, that those of us who are spiritually mature, that we should think that same way, that we should be pursuing Christ's likeness with the intensity of a runner, stretching and reaching towards the finish line. And if we aren't pursuing Christ's likeness with the intensity of an athlete competing in a competition, if we aren't living our lives in such a way as to clearly demonstrate that our ultimate goal is eternal in the heavens, and if we can't get it right as the Lord's church, then how do we expect the world to be any different? And with that in mind, as we wrap up our look at the Corinthian church, I want to begin another series within this series under the subtopic of it's not how you start, but how you finish. It's not how you start, but how you finish. Because in life, things don't always start out smoothly. Everyone doesn't always have a good beginning. And from the start, none of us, I said from the start, none of us were where God wanted us to be. But thank God that God can take us and God can remake us into what he would have us to be. And if we're going to make it where God would have us be, I'm persuaded that no matter what, we have to keep moving forward. We have to keep moving forward. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, continuing in that same thought process, Paul's message here, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning in verse number 24 and concluding in verse number 27. And for clarity and understanding, I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version of the Bible. And here the Bible says, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. This evening, I want to use for a devotional subject, running for the sole purpose of receiving the prize. Running for the sole purpose of receiving the prize. Previously, we indicated that Paul visited Corinth and he established the church there during his second missionary journey. After departing Corinth, and at a later time, Paul wrote this particular letter because of things that he had heard about the church and questions that had been addressed to him. In chapters 1 through 6, he's dealing with what he had heard. In chapter 7 through 9, he's dealing with what he had been asked. You recall in chapter 7, there was a question regarding marriage. In chapter 8, there was a question regarding eating meat that had been offered to idols. And in chapter 9, as Paul discusses, really in the same context of the meat that had been offered to idols, as Paul discusses his right to do certain things and his willingness to surrender those rights if it would cause his brother to stumble. He then states in chapter 9, verses 19 through 23, that although he didn't have to, although he had liberty to do certain things, although he didn't have to, he sacrificed of himself, that he sacrificed certain rights so that he could win others to Christ. It says that to the Jews, he became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those outside the law, he became as one outside the law in order to win those outside the law. And to the weak, he became weak so as to win those who were weak. And in verse 23, he says that he did all those things for the sake of the gospel. That beginning in verse number 24, and then beginning in verse number 24, he says, do you not know that in a race, all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? And then he says, so run that you may obtain it. He did all those things. He sacrificed those things for the sake of the gospel, that he may share with them that they may share with them in its blessings. And then he talks about running in the race. He says in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 24, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. And as I read these verses, I'm mindful of the fact that in modern marathon running, racing, or losing rather, is broadly defined as a failure to reach the finish line. You really don't lose a marathon. If you make it 26 miles, oh, you were successful. You have to understand that. And so in modern marathon running, now we understand that there's a guy from Ethiopia or from Africa or whatever that will probably win this thing. But if you run in the marathon and you make it to the finish line, generally speaking, you were successful. And in modern marathon running, losing is broadly defined as a failure to reach the finish line. The New York City Marathon, they say, counts itself as the largest marathon in the world. The course covers all 5 boroughs of New York City. It begins on Staten Island and it winds through Brooklyn. It crosses the Pulaski Bridge and moves over into Queens. They say after about 2.5 miles in Queens, runners cross the East River on the Queensboro Bridge over into Manhattan. And they say that it is at this point in the race when many runners, they begin to tire. As they climb up the Queensboro Bridge, it is considered one of the most difficult points in the marathon. And they say that of the 60,000 runners who register for the New York Marathon, that only about 45,000 will show up. 60,000 register, but only 45,000 actually show up and start the race. And of that 45,000, it goes without saying that many don't finish. And as we consider 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse number 24, and this picture that Paul paints for us, perhaps an equivalent to the modern marathon is what Paul had in mind as he compares the journey of a Christian to that of a race. And at that time, the Isthmian Games were celebrated in Corinth. And as we've been looking at this Corinthian letter, as we've been considering the Church of Christ at Corinth, we've indicated and we've pointed out different things that were occurring in Corinth that could have contributed to the behavior that was an issue within the Corinthian church. And this is another one of those things, as Paul uses this picture, this analogy that he's painting about this running. The Isthmian Games were celebrated in Corinth. And so here Paul uses something that they would be familiar with. And he says, when you run in the games, you don't run for the sake of running. You run for the sole and singular purpose of receiving the prize. As Christians, we can't run simply to compete. See, some folks are satisfied to just be in the race. But losing in a marathon is broadly defined as a failure to reach the finish line. And I'm persuaded that Paul's point is that we as Christians, that we must run in such a way as to ensure that we make it to the finish line. And then he says in verse 25 through verse number 27, he says, every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. At that time, the winner wore a wreath that was made of pine leaves. And of course, those leaves would perish. But as Christians, we strive for a crown that will never fade away. In verse 26, Paul then says that he doesn't run as one without a purpose, that he's not running simply to compete, that he has a heavenly goal ahead of him. And he's not simply throwing punches in the air, that he's carefully disciplining his own body to ensure that he not only says what God says, but that he does what God says, so that he himself won't be disqualified. And so in looking at the Church of Christ at Corinth, Paul acknowledged that their environment had gotten the best of them, that they had a myriad of issues, and no one would suggest that they started out strong. But in these verses, I hear Paul saying to the Christians at Corinth, and I hear Paul saying to all of us, that it's not so important how you start, but what is most important is how you finish, and that you finish. Because we're not running simply for the sake of running. No, we're running for the sole purpose of making it to the finish line, so that we can receive something far greater than a trophy, something far greater than a championship ring. We're running to receive a crown that will never fade away. And with that in mind, and since we have a bit more time, I want to quickly look at three different types of runners, because just like with the New York Marathon, all runners won't finish the race. All runners won't receive the prize. And we as Christians must run that we might obtain. And for brief consideration, I want to look at three types of runners. I want to look at the fugitive, the treadmiller, and the sprinter. The fugitive, the treadmiller, and the sprinter. And I pray that if you see yourself in one of these runners, that you will heed Paul's advice and make up in your mind to begin running for the sole purpose of receiving the prize. And so first, the fugitive. The fugitive is someone that I consider to be running, but running in the wrong direction. Some people are running, but they are running away from God and not to God. And the way you recognize a fugitive is that although they hear and know what God says, they choose not to obey. They choose not to follow it. For me, I view these individuals as those individuals who are still outside of Christ. God calls them to obey him, and God calls them to be his child, to be a part of his family, but they won't obey. It reminds me of Paul in Acts chapter 9, when he was still Saul, and the Lord appeared to him, and he said, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? How long will you kick against the pricks? How long will you refuse to accept me and to follow me? And so Paul, as when he was Saul, he was living his life as a fugitive, and those fugitives, instead of running toward God and the finish line, the fugitive tries to run away. It calls to mind Jonah chapter 1, verse 1 through verse number 3, where the Bible says, now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. This has always been man's problem. God said, go up to Nineveh. Man chooses to go down somewhere else. God tells us to go up, and then we choose to go down. God says run toward the finish line, but then man chooses to run as a fugitive in the other direction. Jonah tried to run from God, but he learned what every fugitive will eventually and ultimately learn, that you can't beat God in a foot race. God's not like law enforcement. Sometimes you can get away from law enforcement. Sometimes they have a show called Cops. I don't know if you've ever watched the episodes or whatever, but Cops, they'll be chasing some individuals, and they'll call over the radio, and then the helicopter will show up. And the funny thing about the helicopter is, because the helicopter is so high in the air, that no matter where you try to go, the helicopter is so high that it can still see you. And it's always funny to me, but they never get away from that helicopter. And we understand that God sits high, but he looks low. And there's a song that we sing that there's an all-seeing eye watching you. And so God sits so high. He sits high enough to where no matter where we try to run as fugitives, God can still see us, and we can't outrun God. And no matter how far Jonah tried to run and tried to get away, Jonah could not escape God's judgment. And so that's one type of runner. It's the fugitive, the person that instead of running to God, they're trying to run away from God. And then the second type of runner is the treadmiller. And this is the individual who's running, but they're running in place. As we have discussed at length, some Christians in Corinth struggled with a number of issues. And when it comes to treadmill running, this is where the Christian has to be careful, because the Christian may misinterpret movement for forward progress. We may misinterpret Christian practice for spiritual maturity. See, the treadmill runner runs, but he doesn't go anywhere. And I have to admit that I prefer running on a treadmill. And on the treadmill, I expend a lot of energy. I sweat profusely. I move my arms. I move my legs. But make no mistake about it, I don't go anywhere. A person in a rocking chair is moving. Yes, he is. But he's not going anywhere. And so the Christians in Corinth, they were adhering to Christian practice, but they weren't growing spiritually. They were adhering to Christian practice. They were having worship services. They were partaking of the Lord's Supper. They were exercising their spiritual gifts, but make no mistake about it, they weren't growing or progressing as God intended. The treadmill runner participates in many outward acts of service to God. But since he initially obeyed the gospel, there has been little forward progress in his life. In other words, there has been little to no spiritual growth, and he finds himself still in the same exact place spiritually that he was years ago when he started the Christian race. And you remember that Paul had gone to Corinth. He established a church there. He stayed with them for 18 months and continued to uplift them and to teach them and to help build them up. And then he departed. And after he departed, he heard certain things and they had questions, and he penned this particular letter. And then this letter in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, after 18 months and the additional time that Paul had been away, he writes and he says, "But I, brothers, could not address you as spiritual people, but as people of the flesh, as infants in Christ." He says, "I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for it. And even now you are not ready, for you are still of the flesh." And so after all this time, after this time had passed, they still had not progressed to where Paul and God thought they should be. And so we can be partaking and participating in many outward acts of service to God, and there still be little spiritual growth. And we may find ourselves in the same exact place spiritually that we were years ago when we first started the Christian race. There's a story told of a 17-year-old boy, 17 years old, who kept falling out of bed. And acknowledging that was pretty strange for a boy that old, his father finally sat him down and asked him, "Son, why do you keep falling out of the bed?" And the young man thought for a few minutes and then answered, "Well, I guess I just remained too close to the point where I first got in." And this might be the case for some Christians, as there's little to no spiritual growth, because although they adhere to outward practice, there's no inward change. And ultimately, they remain very close to where they started, not far removed from the world that they were supposed to be separated from. The treadmill runner is running. Yes, he is, but he's not going anywhere. And he's not running to receive the prize. And then finally, there's the sprinter. The sprinters are those individuals who they're fast out the gate, but then they can't maintain. Success is not determined at the start of the race. Success is decided at the finish line. They don't crown the winners when they start. Now, they may have some favorites, but they don't crown the winners when they start. They crown the winners when they finish. That's why there's this idea of an upset. You know, the guy that we thought was supposed to win didn't win, because they don't crown winners when they start. They crown the winners at the finish line. And with that in mind, the Christian race is not a sprint, but a marathon. And if you don't have the stamina, if you don't have the endurance, and if you don't have a strong will and the faith to finish the race, you won't receive the prize. And what that means is that things may not always go smoothly. The race is not always going to be easy. In the New York Marathon, they say once you start climbing up that bridge, that's when people start to get tired, and that's when some people quit and they turn back. And as we consider this Christian journey, there are going to be obstacles along the way. There are going to be challenges and struggles that we face. We're going through a pandemic right now, but no matter what, if we ever hope to get where God would have us to be, we have to keep moving forward. Think about it. If you're in a marathon, if you keep running, eventually you'll make it to the finish line. For some people, that might be the next day. For some, it might be after everybody has gone home, but you're still running, you're trying to make it. But if you keep moving forward, eventually you'll make it. And so Satan recognizes that that we're in a race, and he recognizes that that his sole purpose is to place obstacles and difficulties in our way so that we might be hindered from making it to the finish line. In John chapter 6, around verse 2, we find that a great multitude of folks were following Jesus. And, you know, he had performed great miracles. He had fed folks. He had walked on water. He had healed folks. And there are numerous people who were excited about what the Lord could do for them in a physical sense. And then in John chapter 6, verse 26, Jesus basically says that most of those folks were following him only because he had fed them and only because they had gotten full. They had a sprinter's mentality. They were there for as long as Jesus blessed them physically and materially. They were there as long as the race was quick. They were there as long as it didn't require a long bout of energy. But if the race included some hills, if the race included some hardships, some bridges, if the race became difficult, then the sprinter, they don't have the stamina, they don't have the endurance, they don't have that strong will to keep moving forward. And the sprinter will then stop and turn back, and they won't ever receive the prize. And so Jesus says in John 6, and the Bible says rather in John 6 in verse number 60, when many of his disciples heard it, they said, "This is a hard saying. Who can listen to it?" And this wasn't even about, you know, struggle and strife. It was just about Jesus saying that he was the bread of life. And if they eat him, and it was talking about him in a spiritual sense, and they couldn't deal with that teaching, you know. And so we look at this and we say, well, you know, when it gets hard, you know, we understand that the Christian race is not easy. And it is a race that is run by faith. And when faced with trouble, we must have faith that God will bring us through. And then we'll testify later that, you know, had it not been for God. In verse, drop down, verse 66 and 67 in John 6, it says, after this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. So Jesus then said to the 12, do you want to go away as well? Satan is searching for sprinters. Satan is searching for those who start out fast and they start the Christian race strong, but don't have the staying power to finish. As soon as trouble comes and as soon as the walk becomes difficult, their faith wavers and they forget about the one who gives them the strength and who will give them the strength to finish the race. And as Christians, we have to keep moving forward. The Christian journey it's a marathon that we must run by faith. We must run with patience. We must run with perseverance and endurance. The Hebrew writers said in Hebrews 12, beginning in verse number 1, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. You remember that in chapter 11. And so here the writer of Hebrews is referring back to those heroes of faith that were cited in chapter 11, to Abel, to Enoch, to Noah, and Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob, to Moses, to Rahab, to David, to Samuel, and to others. And he's using their faith. He's using their perseverance and their endurance as an example. And then he says, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely. In the Christian race, we must put off and lay aside everything that might slow us down. Every obstacle, every hindrance, and especially sin. And then he says, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus. When you're in a race, this is a sprinting analogy, but sprinters and runners always keep their eyes fixed forward. They say that when you're sprinting and you're racing, the time that it takes you to quickly look back might be the time that it takes for you to lose, because you lose your momentum. And so as Christians, we must keep our eyes fixed forward, fixed where? Looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. As Christians, we can't run this race as fugitives. We can't run this race on the treadmill, and we can't run this race as if it's a sprint. The Christian journey it's a marathon. We must run by faith with patience, perseverance, and endurance. And it's not how you start, but how you finish. Have you ever known an individual that when you knew them initially, they weren't a faithful Christian, but 2 or 3 years down the road, 5 or 10 years down the road, 15 or 20 years down the road. See, for some folks, the race takes a little bit longer for them to get to where God would have them to be. But 15, 20 years down the road, now they're a faithful Christian. And we see Paul saying that, listen, Church of Christ at Corinth, you've had some issues, but moving forward, listen, it's not how you start, but how you finish. And someone has rightfully said that in order to finish, we need Jesus to inspire us. We need the word of God to teach us, prayers of the righteous to strengthen us, true brothers and sisters to stick by us, spiritual leaders to guide us. And I pray that with everything that I have in me, that you're not running for the sake of running, but that you're running for the sole purpose of reaching the finish line and receiving your prize. Being a Christian and living like one. Being a Christian and running like one is two different things. Obedience to the gospel of Christ simply puts us and places us into a relationship with the Father. But then comes the hard part, because then we got to get running. Then comes the hard part, because then we got to have some stamina. We got to have some endurance. We got to have some faith. We got to persevere. Then comes the hard part, because then we have to live and run like we know who our Father is. And if you're listening tonight and you have yet to obey the gospel, you're still a fugitive. You have to understand that as a fugitive, you're not really even in the race yet. But if you're ready to obey the gospel and start running, not away from God, but to God, we ask that you contact us, that we might assist you in your obedience. And if you have prayer requests, maybe you recognize you've been on a spiritual treadmill, that you've been participating in many outward acts, but you haven't been growing spiritually as God would have you to grow, and you would like us to pray with you and for you, we want to do that as well. We ask that you make those things known. And so at this time, make them known. We're going to move into a song, and I just want to thank you all for listening, and may God continue to bless you and bless us all in a mighty, mighty way. Thank you so much tonight.